Cause of the 1905 revolution. Long-term causes. Scale and diversity. Russia covered over 1/6 of the world's landmass, making it harder to govern. Only half the population of Russia was actual Russians. There were many different types of nationalities in Russia. These created national minorities around the borders, which made it extremely difficult to govern. To try and make things easier to govern, the government introduced the policy of Russification, which was resented by national minorities. Minorities saw Russification as a fundamental attack, especially when Russians received important jobs, even in the national minorities' own regional governments. Weaknesses of Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas became Tsar in 1894, but he was shy, unassertive, unorganised and not interested in Russia's politics. He was not equal to the tasks that confronted him, such as the peasant discontent to the harvest failures. The Tsar's wife Alexandra encouraged him not to form a representative assembly. This showed his firm belief in autocracy. This belief was further enhanced by the Tsar's use of repression to subdue any opposition. Demands for political change. There were two main groups which wanted political change. There were the non-revolutionaries, who wanted the Tsar to reform, and the revolutionaries, who wanted to overthrow Tsarism. The non-revolutionaries were known as liberals. They were the middle classes who wanted some form of representative assembly where they could consult with the Tsar on policies. The revolutionaries were split in two: the social revolutionaries, whose support came from the peasantry, and the social democrats, whose support came from the working classes. Countryside crisis. The peasants had backwards farming methods which limited productivity. The peasants were also limited themselves by the peasant commune system, the mir, which restricted travel and freedom of enterprise. They also had frequent harvest failures, which caused great discontent. This discontent was increased when they were heavily taxed for the industrialization policy. Official government policy of low bread prices meant that there was a low income for farmers even when harvests were good. This meant that many peasants couldn't pay their heavy taxes and then fell behind on redemption payments. The government policy of exploiting grain to fund the industrial policies led to severe food shortages. The population was on a never-ending increase, which increased pressure upon peasants' holdings that were already inadequate for their size. The peasant discontent led to them responding with violence. Industrial backwardness. The industrial policy was encouraged by Sergei Witt, the Prime Minister at the time. He introduced tariffs on imports to protect infant Russian industries and encouraged foreign investment in Russian industry. Witt then placed the Russian currency on the gold standard. This was to create greater international confidence in the national currency. Witt's success was mixed. There was industrial growth in some areas but not all. Coal and oil in 1910 was only 30% of Russia's national production was industrial, compared to the 75% in Britain alone. The downfall in this policy was that it was mainly funded by heavy taxation on the peasantry, which only increased their discontent. Industry had a poor transport system. The railway construction programme increased the amount of railway track, but it was still a lot less than those in other European countries. There was a lot of growth in urban working classes, the industrial workers. In 1900, 2.5 million workers were employed in the factories or workshops. This number only increased, and so did the workers' discontent with their working and living conditions. Their conditions were very poor, which led to an increase of strikes and protests. 1895 had 68 protests, 1900 had 125 strikes, and 1905 had 14,000 strikes. Short-term causes. Economic depression. There was an industrial slump after 1902. Russia could no longer sell the products of its industry. Thousands of workers lost their jobs and strikes broke out in major cities. There was further problems in the countryside. Bad harvests in 1900 and 1902 pushed the peasants into starvation. After being squeezed by Witt's economics policies, the peasants were now at breaking point. From 1902 to 1904, peasants' uprisings erupted sporadically. The government's response was suppression. The problems that were added on by the Russo-Japanese War made the economic conditions worse. Russo-Japanese War. Both Russia and Japan wanted to spread their empire more in the Far East, trying to take advantage of the weak Chinese Empire. February 1904, Japan began a naval attack on the Russian-controlled Port Arthur. The Tsar also thought a short victorious war would distract the people about the ongoing problems at home in Russia. Russians suffered a humiliating defeat. This was due to multiple reasons. Poor communication. Even though Russia had a much larger population than Japan, Japan was able to access easier ways to the front line of war. The Russians mainly used the Trans-Siberian Railway. This made it harder to get troops and equipment to the front line, as the track was usually clogged up, making the Russian army smaller. Weakness in leadership. Russia's command structure was weakened by the rivalries of the regular army commanders and the court favourites, as they had split on opinion on how to deal with the affairs of this war. Military defeats. The surrender of Port Arthur in 1905 greatly damaged the army morale. The defeat at the Battle of Mukden in February-March time in 1905 was also very damaging to all morale around Russia. The more experienced and trained soldiers were kept in major cities to put down unrest, which meant the Japanese had much more fanatical soldiers in the war. The Japanese also had better equipment. Naval defeat. The Russian Navy failed to make much of an impact. The popular Russian commander, Admiral Makarov, died when his flagship struck Japanese mines. In May 1905, the Russian Baltic Fleet was defeated by Japanese at the Straits of Tsushima. 25 of its 35 ships were lost. The peace settlement. The Treaty of Portsmouth was negotiated in August 1905, which in reality let the Russians off lightly. They did lose Port Arthur and Leotang Peninsula. They did not have to pay reparations. Russia also maintained its dominance in Manchuria. However, this marked a turning point in Russian foreign policy. The Russians now decided to move west toward Europe rather than east. Spark. Bloody Sunday. On the 22nd of January 1905, the peasants planned to present a loyal petition for the redress of their grievances to the Tsar at his winter palace in St. Petersburg. Father Gapan, leader of Assembly of Russian Factory Workers, led 150,000 people to present this petition. The imperial troops guarding the Winter Palace opened fire on the crowd, killing around 1,000 people. February 1905, 400,000 workers went on strike. This rose to 2.7 million by the end of the year. The Russian economy was brought on the verge of collapse. Also, in February 1905, peasant unrest soon spread as they became more concerned with the land issues. These opportunities were exploited by radical political parties such as the Social Revolutionaries. National minorities began to get involved in their unrest and formed minor political groups. Mutinies in the army and navy began to increase, most notably the mutiny on board a battleship at Potemkin in 1905, June.